Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're completely dismantling those sensationalized headlines you always see about national bankruptcy, and we're looking at the actual mechanics of emerging market macroeconomics. You know the narrative. You always hear that a country simply borrowed too much money and couldn't pay it back. Well, while that's technically true, it's dangerously incomplete. So we are going way beyond the surface today to understand the very real asset-liability structures that actually govern global debt. Sovereigns don't run out of debt capacity. They run out of rollover capacity. Let's just strike down a widely held myth right now. There is no magic debt to GDP number, like 90%, that automatically triggers a default. The reality is so much more mechanical than that. I mean, think about Japan. Japan runs a debt ratio that would instantly vaporize most emerging markets, yet it survives just fine. Why? Because it borrows in its own currency from its own incredibly deep domestic investor base. A country doesn't suddenly run out of debt capacity all at once. What it runs out of is the ability to refinance. To really grasp this, we've got to understand that sovereign default lives right at the intersection of a country's economic capacity and its political willingness to pay. Unlike a regular corporation, a sovereign government has immense power, right? It can tax, it can cut spending, it can print its local currency, or it can even literally rewrite its domestic laws. Because of these unique tools, a sovereign default is ultimately a highly political choice. But governments also have very hard limits. They cannot print US dollars, and they absolutely cannot tax their citizens beyond what the political system will tolerate. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. We're hitting the rollover machine, the three fragile ledgers, the snowball and doom loop mechanics, some real-world breaking points, and finally, the critical point model. Section 1. The rollover machine, when the engine breaks. Think about the sheer scale and the makeup of the players involved here. Based on recent projections, cross-border portfolio flows to emerging markets are approaching a staggering $4 trillion by 2025. But notice the massive 80% slice. That's non-banks. We are talking about hedge funds, mutual funds, and ETFs. These are benchmark-driven investors who can, and absolutely will, pull their capital incredibly fast during a global risk shock. Understanding exactly who is holding the debt is absolutely crucial to knowing when the rollover machine is going to grind to a halt. Because here's the reality. Government finance operates on a continuous loop. Governments almost never pay off debt using a giant pile of tax cash sitting in a vault somewhere. Step 1, they collect taxes. Step 2, they issue new debt to investors. Step 3, they use that newly raised money to repay the old maturing debt. A crisis doesn't happen just because the total debt is high. A crisis is triggered precisely when step 2 fails. It happens when investors look at the risk and simply refuse to buy new debt at affordable rates to pay off the old ones. When that machine inevitably breaks, creditors and institutions like the IMF get shoved into this terrifying gray zone, trying to answer one massive question. Are we looking at a liquidity crisis, where a country just needs a temporary bridge loan to get past a maturity wall or an external shock? Or is this a solvency crisis, where the debt burden is fundamentally unpayable without an unrealistic amount of austerity, meaning investors are going to have to take a permanent haircut? Getting this wrong is devastating. If you force a permanent haircut on a country that just needed a temporary bridge loan, you could literally lock them out of global markets for a decade. Section 2. Fragile ledgers. 3 emerging market breakpoints. Emerging market default risk isn't just one single metric flashing red. It's really a simultaneous collapse across 3 distinct ledgers. First, you have the fiscal ledger. That's the government's own budget of revenues versus interest and spending. Second, the external ledger. The country's actual hard currency dollars, which are absolutely vital for paying foreign debts and importing essentials like fuel and medicine. And third, the domestic ledger, the local banking system. A true crisis happens when all 3 of these deteriorate at the exact same time. Like when a massive fiscal deficit drains your external reserves, forcing the government to lean heavily on domestic banks, which in turn severely weakens the local currency. Section 3. Snowball and loop. Mechanics of distress. Let's talk about the cold, hard math of the snowball effect. Say a country is paying a 6% real interest rate on its debt, but its economy is only growing at 2%. In that scenario, its debt ratio automatically compounds upward. It just snowballs. To stop that snowball, the government has to run a strict primary surplus, meaning they have to severely cut spending or hike taxes just to tread water. And let me tell you, trying to deliver a 4 or 5% primary surplus for a decade straight isn't just an economic challenge, it's very often a complete political impossibility. Now, what happens if foreign investors suddenly flee? Well, the government usually forces local institutions to step up and absorb that debt. This is where we enter the doom loop. The government makes local banks buy its bonds, but as the sovereign risk rises, those bond prices start to fall. Suddenly, the banks suffer massive losses on their balance sheets, and the whole banking system teeters on the verge of collapse. So what happens next? The government has to step in to rescue the banks, which requires issuing even more debt. It's a vicious cycle. Saving the sovereign weakens the banks, and rescuing the banks ultimately destroys the sovereign. Section 4. Breaking Points. Real-world trauma. Let's ground all this theory in reality, because every crisis has a totally different trigger. Take Sri Lanka back in 2022. They suffered a brutal external hard currency break. Their usable reserves were completely depleted, which led to a severe shortage of essential imports like medicine and fuel. That turned a financial crisis into a full-blown social crisis, very quickly. Next, consider Ghana. They fell right into a domestic debt trap. Their local bonds were heavily held by domestic banks and pensions, which meant that restructuring the debt directly threatened the life savings of their own citizens. Finally, Argentina. They perfectly highlight the political willingness constraint, where the lack of a credible nominal anchor just leads to repeated, agonizing cycles of inflation and restructuring. Section 5. Critical Point, a predictive diagnostic. So, how do we actually spot the next crisis? The first half of our critical point model dashboard hunts for these glaring pink shutoff warnings across 4 specific modules. In fiscal solvency, we're looking for governments that suddenly need politically impossible surpluses just to stay afloat. In financing needs, we look closely at near-term maturity walls, essentially asking, can the government even survive the next 12 months? For external liquidity, we are watching for depleted usable reserves, which creates a nightmare scenario where a country literally has to choose between paying foreign bondholders or importing food. And finally, in currency mismatch, we monitor that fatal trap where a country needs to devalue its currency to fix exports, but doing so causes the local cost of its foreign dollar debt to absolutely explode. The second half of the dashboard monitors the broader ecosystem. We watch for the saturation of local banks entering that dreaded doom loop. We look at market access. Is debt yielding so high that issuing it only makes the path worse? We closely monitor the official sector backstop, which is essentially asking whether the IMF is going to demand private creditors take losses before they'll even offer a bailout. And finally, the ultimate warning module, politics. Remember, sovereign default is essentially a political event wearing a balance sheet costume. The red flag flashes the moment the required financial adjustment simply exceeds what the political system and the populace can survive without revolt. The actual default point is completely nonlinear. Things can look difficult but remain totally stable for a long time, right up until one single bond auction fails or one local bank run begins. So as you analyze the global markets tomorrow, don't just look at a country and ask if its total debt is high. That's the wrong question. Instead, ask yourself, which of these ledgers will stop rolling first?